Following the success of The Legend of Zelda, Nintendo released Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link in 1987, taking the series in a drastically different direction. Both the original top-down style of the original and the side-scrolling action RPG style of the second game were hugely successful, and Zelda was now an established series. With the release of the Super Nintendo Entertainment System in 1991, Nintendo was now moving towards the future, and with that move, it was time for a new Zelda to take advantage of the new technology. On April 13th, 1992, Nintendo released The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, moving the series back to the gameplay style of the first game, while giving that style a ton of polish and expansion. The result is one of the most cherished, highly regarded, and hyped up games of all time. As an outsider, someone who didn't grow up with Zelda, I just have to ask, is A Link to the Past actually that good? Does this game really live up to the hype and justify all of that praise? Or is it just nostalgia and bias making everyone put this game on a pedestal? Well, there's only one way to find out. We'll be talking about the story, the gameplay and design, and the impact this game would have on the Zelda series as a whole. So, without further ado, let's take a look.
There will be spoilers.
Booting up the game, we get a cool opening showing off some of the Super Nintendo's bells and whistles and setting the scene. Now, instead of a text crawl, the game actually tells us the legend of the Triforce and all that good stuff. Long ago, stories were told of a place called the Golden Land. But one day, evil power flowed from this land, so the King of Hyrule had 7 wise men seal off the Golden Land. Eventually, a wizard named Aghanim? Some wizard came to Hyrule to break the seal and eliminate the descendants of the 7 wise men. He has taken over Hyrule Castle, and Princess Zelda is running out of time. This is where Link comes in. Starting the game, Zelda pleads for help and explains that she's locked in the castle dungeon. That night, Link's uncle goes out and tells Link to stay home. So, Link goes into the castle dungeon and finds Uncle is hurt badly. Uncle explains that he didn't want Link to get involved, gives him his sword, and is about to tell Link something, but doesn't finish before dying. Zelda is your... ... Alas, poor uncle, we hardly knew ye. From there, Link fights through the castle dungeon and saves Zelda, escaping to the sanctuary where she'll be safe. Some powerful evil force is influencing Aggie, and in order to defeat him, Link needs to go to the village elder and follow his advice to obtain the Master Sword. He's hiding, but once you find him, he tells you to go to 3 dungeons and collect the pendants within. Funny enough, the 3rd dungeon is on Death Mountain. While we're here, we dip our toes into one of this game's signature gimmicks, the Dark World. Step onto one of these tiles in the Light World and you'll end up in the Dark World. But while you're there, you'll turn into a bunny, so you're unable to defend yourself. Luckily, the magic mirror brings you back to the Light World, and you'll have to swap back and forth to enter the Tower of Hera on Death Mountain. So while you're here, you're looking for the last pendant, but also for the Moon Pearl to stay in your human form in the Dark World. Now that that's done, it's time to go get the Master Sword. But there's no time to celebrate. Soldiers attack the sanctuary and take Zelda back to the castle, so Link has to go save her again. This time we actually fight Agamemnon, and after defeating him, we find ourselves in the Dark World. The Elder telepathically tells us that this place used to be the Golden Land, but evil has corrupted it. The wizard broke the seal between worlds and is using the castle to connect the two. To stop him, Link must fight through 7 dungeons and rescue the 7 descendants of the Wise Men in order to win the Triforce and save the Light World. As we rescue the maidens, we get bits of info about the power of the Triforce. It was hidden away, but eventually a thief named Ganondorf discovered its location. He was stuck in the Dark World and started scheming. If Ganon crosses over into the Light World, you're gonna have a bad time. Eventually, it's time to go back to Death Mountain in the Dark World to conquer the Tower of Ganon. At the end, we face off one more time with Agriculture himself, but he goes down easy. Ganon then appears directly, making it explicit that he was controlling the wizard. But Link is able to escape, and now it's almost time for the final battle. But first, we gotta get the Super Bomb so we can blow up a wall at the pyramid and get the silver arrows and the golden sword. The silver arrows are a nice callback to the first game, as once again they're required. Jumping into the pyramid, now it's time to beat Ganon and save the world. This fight's actually not that hard, but I had to try it several times because I kept getting knocked off the edge of the arena, forcing me to restart. I hate that mechanic, but otherwise it's not too bad. We beat Ganon, get the Triforce, and save the day. Then we get a Where Are They Now sequence for the characters, and the credits roll. It's not an overly complicated story, but it is nice that this time they try to make the story feel like an actual legend, and you continue to hear about it as you play through the game. It helps Hyrule feel like a real place with some history behind it, and makes the story feel like more than just an excuse plot to send players off on an adventure. It also made me feel like I was really a hero fulfilling a legend. It's good stuff. Link's back for another adventuresome quest in the land of Hyrule, and this time we're back to the classic top-down view of the original game. No more side-scrolling, no more XP, no more downward thrust. I miss it already. Like the first game, Link can fight using his sword and his huge toolbox of other goodies. Overall, his arsenal is much richer, and it's a big improvement. In the original game, he just awkwardly stabbed in front of himself, and it didn't really have much reach. Now the sword actually slashes, so you can hit stuff around you better, and you have more reach. On top of that, you have a spin slash that you can charge up to hit lots of stuff around you. These tweaks are a huge deal considering how awkward the sword was before. You also have a lot of tools. You'll get the Pegasus shoes, allowing you to dash around the world quickly. Up to 4 bottles can be found to hold potions or other goodies, and the flute allows you to fast travel around the light world. While you can't use it in the dark world, you can freely warp to one of a handful of locations which are near dark world dungeons, and they have tiles for quick dark world access. Being able to actually choose where to go also makes traveling a breeze. Other tools include boomerangs, bow and arrows, magic rods, bombs, the magic hammer, magic medallions, a cape that gives invincibility, and my favorite, the hook shot. Shoot enemies, grab stuff from afar, or go across gaps. That thing is awesome. And one of my other favorite tools? We actually have a world map this time. Man, this thing is a godsend. Moving around feels so crisp and precise. I feel like I'm in total control, and I feel like the game is a lot more reasonable than before. In addition to having more controllable fast travel, continuing is nice too. In the Dark World, you can only continue from the Pyramid, but in the Light World, you can continue from your house, Sanctuary, or the cave on Death Mountain. Yeah, they actually put a continue point on Death Mountain. And in both worlds, dying in a dungeon lets you continue at the dungeon entrance. As much as I loved Zelda 2, continuing from Hyrule Castle no matter what was bullshit. And it suddenly not being like that anymore at the Great Palace was even more bullshit. A Link to the Past is both consistent and reasonable about this, so I can't complain. With all these toys and upgrades, playing around in Hyrule has never felt so good. It might not have that same intense life and death feeling that Zelda 2 had, but it's really smooth and enjoyable. So, how's Hyrule itself? Hyrule felt like an apocalyptic wasteland in the original game. It was supposed to feel desolate and lonely, but maybe it worked too well, and I felt like it didn't really do a good job of feeling like a real place. I also found the NPCs that were there to often be cryptic and unhelpful, but your mileage may vary. The second game improved a lot on this by having actual towns with people to talk to, and while they were still cryptic sometimes, I thought they were a big improvement on the first game. They were more helpful and lively and made Hyrule feel more like a real place. This time around, I think they finally nailed it. There's villages and towns and shops and other various people all over Hyrule, and they feel like they've got charm and personality. Even shops have some personality now, like the potion shop with the stereotypical witch outside. Some of these elements were already in Zelda 1 and disappeared in Zelda 2, like the gambling games and shops. But where in that game they were just detached gamey means to an end, here they feel much more organic. And between the fortune teller shop, the abundance of NPC hints, and the world map, the game's a lot more intuitive and straightforward to navigate this time around. The settings themselves are also worth giving a lot of attention. Zelda 1 had a world that largely just feels like the same stuff over and over, but with new paint. The overworld of Zelda 2 made some big improvements since you could travel around bridges with water pits, caverns with lava pits, caves, swamps, deserts, etc. But since the majority of content is in the palaces, you still ultimately just stare at lots of hallways only differentiated by colors. Or to put it another way, the first two games could get pretty repetitive in terms of aesthetics and design. A Link to the Past makes use of the new technology available to really flesh out Hyrule and add a lot more variety. There's grassy fields, mountains and caves, water areas, swamps, desert, forest, lots of stuff. A nice new thing is that at some points of the game there's rain effects. This is nothing new to us here in the 21st century, but considering how the entirety of the NES games look like a clear sunny day or whatever, weather effects help create a sense of doom and gloom and offer some variety. Maybe I'm getting a little too carried away with the window dressing, but it's a nice touch. The dungeons also have a lot of variety. Like previous games, each has an important item to collect and a boss to fight to progress. The Light World initially has the Hyrule Castle and some dungeons, including a romp through Death Mountain. It's not quite as early as Zelda 2, but it still pops up pretty early here. A great use of technology here is how Death Mountain actually feels like a giant mountain high above the ground. Before, you'd have to use your imagination and pretend, but this is a mountain. In that dungeon, there's this worm boss in an arena surrounded by a pit. If you fall in, you'll have to climb back up and restart the fight. It's annoying having to restart the fight, but this is an interesting thing to worry about, and hey, at least you don't just die instantly when you fall in. Going through the forest like a mini dungeon to get to the Master Sword is a cool moment, as we don't have to have a full dungeon for the game to have interesting design. And I like how the forest is lit with shade from the trees. Once we get to the Dark World and start going through those dungeons, things get really interesting. A Link to the Past was just warming up before, but now it's ready to play its hand. We have an ice dungeon with ice physics and all that. The Skull Woods use the Dark World's version of the forest to create an interesting dungeon design where you look for entrances or pits to enter various areas of the dungeon below so that eventually you can get to the boss. The Water Dungeon, which requires the flippers, requires you to go into the Light World to pull a switch, then go back into the Dark World to swim around and enter the dungeon proper. Dungeons often involve more puzzle solving now, like using switches to raise or lower blocks, or teleporting around using floor tiles, or the aforementioned water switch. Something both NES games really struggled with was puzzles. Zelda 1 puzzles boil down to blowing up or burning some arbitrary thing or pushing some arbitrary block, and Zelda 2 pretty much got rid of them entirely. Now there's a lot more brain teasing and a lot more variety. As I said earlier, it's also a lot more intuitive. I really like how they added cracks to bombable walls. I don't really care for just guessing what walls I can blow up, so I like this. So, to bring it all together, A Link to the Past has a world that feels more lively, intuitive, and varied to play around in than we could have ever gotten from the NES games. It's an impressive jump from the origins of the series, and it's also the birth of the famous Zelda formula. Adventuring, going through dungeons, solving puzzles, collecting stuff to become more powerful and progress, it's all here. So what's the final verdict on A Link to the Past? This is a game that's interesting for me. In my review of the first game, I mentioned that I'd played about half of this before putting it down. At the time, I thought the game was a little bland. In a series known for constantly experimenting with its own formula, this one just didn't seem that exciting. Even now, I feel more of a sentimental connection to Zelda 2. I'm a sucker for the oddballs in a series. I really enjoyed Final Fantasy VIII, for example, and I first tried Zelda 2 when I was a kid, so there's more of a personal connection to that one for me. But after playing the first two games more recently and revisiting this one properly, I can't say it's a bad game. It's a tremendous improvement on the previous games in many ways. It's got a much more fleshed out world, better presentation of the story, prettier graphics, much less frustrating and more varied gameplay, more intuitive and believable world design, the whole 9 yards. It's a real treat to play. A polished and refined take on the original game's style that moves the series forward into a new era, this game is great. I just needed more context and experience to really properly appreciate it. Is it my favorite game ever? I wouldn't say that. But it is rock solid and worth checking out for any serious student of retro gaming. Is it really the greatest SNES game ever or whatever? How the hell should I know? It's a video game. Play it and decide for yourself. Both the SNES and GBA versions are on Nintendo Switch Online, so go nuts. If you have any thoughts on A Link to the Past, I'd love to talk about it in the comments down below. Thanks for watching.